Good, well, thank you very much. So my name is David Hone. I'm the Chief Climate Change Advisor at Shell. And I'm going to talk today about our new energy security scenarios. These were released just a month ago. And they frame the way the transition is taking place in the light of what we've seen, the events that we've seen, particularly over the last 12 months, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So with that in mind, and the fact that we're framing this as a world of competitive transition, so it's a different take on the way in which the transition has been imagined before. Let me get going. So before we start, it's always good practice in Shell just to remind you that being a scenarios presentation, there's a number of forward-looking statements, and that means that please don't use this presentation as a reason to invest in Shell equities. You can find other reasons for doing that, I'm sure, but not as a result of what I say today. But on the subject of scenarios, I think it's just worth framing these just a little bit as we get started. Shell has been engaged in scenario planning for over 50 years. It's part of the sort of the fabric of the enterprise. And it forms an important sort of context-setting stage as we develop strategy and ultimately business plans. But the scenarios are not the strategy in itself, and they're not a business plan. They're really there to, as I said, to provide context, to get people thinking about where the world may be heading, to stretch thinking, and also to challenge the status quo. And I think that's always important in developing a strategy to perhaps upend the status quo and make people a little bit uneasy about the future and what it might bring. So these scenarios, as I said, were framed on the back of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But they had their roots in a previous set of scenarios that we developed during the pandemic, where we described security as one of the sort of the key trends emerging. But it sat alongside other trends as well. But I think what we've seen certainly with the invasion and with the status of the energy system, that a security mindset is rapidly emerging throughout the world. And whilst 2 years ago we'd associated a security mindset with a slower transition, I think a deep dive into this reveals that the foundations for a faster transition are there. And this is because of Russia's unique role in the world as a major supplier of oil and gas and coal. And therefore that this event and the energy turmoil that surrounded it has added to the narrative around fossil fuels and the concerns that fossil fuels have in the global energy system. And so it's really brought a new lens onto the energy system. And of course, it's really raised the subject of energy security rapidly up the global agenda. Now, energy security, of course, sits there amongst other drivers. And the key drivers that emerge in this story are, of course, rising energy costs, which are associated with the energy turmoil that we've seen. But that's feeding through to costs in other areas. So, for instance, rising food costs directly associated with energy costs because of, for instance, the link between natural gas to make ammonia, to make fertilizers, and nitrogen fertilizers are important for growing wheat. And of course, that's leading to inflation. Now, sitting behind all this all of the time is the rising global surface temperature. And this is a reality that doesn't go away. It doesn't sort of come and go like political waves of change. It's just a monotonic rise, and it just adds growing pressure to the energy system. And then the third thing is that we are in an era of accelerated technological change. And it's not just around things like digital technologies, but energy technologies as well. And there's, for instance, a lot of venture capital going into energy technologies that's bringing new developments and changes. So those are sort of some of the key drivers that we've thought about in this story. But in addition, there's two real dilemmas that that this story throws up. One is that we've got a part of the world, the least developed economies, that are in need of considerable additional energy requirements. They want to raise their energy service level, and that's going to bring with it large amounts of energy. Many of them, for instance, have domestic coal resources that they are keen to use. And then associated with that, but part of the energy system that exists today, is the diminishing carbon budget. So this is the amount of additional CO2 that could be added to the atmosphere from whatever point you're at before you reach a certain temperature threshold. And for 1.5 degrees C, that's now less than 380 billion tons. And you put that in the context of annual emissions of over 40 billion tons of CO2, and it's really a vanishingly small amount, less than 10 years at current emissions. So these are the two sort of key additional dilemmas that are thrown into this mix. Now, in developing these scenarios, really the first step was to think about the nature of the global response. Do we see a homogeneous response around the world, or a very mixed sort of heterogeneous response? And we opted for the latter, because what we see is that in the immediate energy turmoil, there are different strengths and weaknesses around the world, and countries are building on those strengths and weaknesses in terms of their response to the energy system. And those strengths and weaknesses revolve around a country's ability to manage energy price volatility and a country's ability to manage supply disruption. And so with those two underlying pieces, you end up with a sort of a 2x2. And it gave us four categories of response, four archetype responses to the energy security turmoil that we're seeing around the world. And we gave each of those a name sort of to try and give some depiction of what they meant. But for instance, in the European theatre, these are countries that are managing the price volatility. There's some disruption, but nevertheless managing the price volatility, but are very challenged by the supply disruption. And their response is to reduce energy needs and to develop a strategy to move quickly away from oil and gas, because that's where the supply disruption occurs. And these are the countries that we call the green dream countries. Now, if you go over to major resource holders, such as in North America, but also in the Middle East, these are countries that may actually increase production in the short term to manage supply. They're not themselves challenged by supply disruption, but they are challenged by price volatility, mainly for political reasons. Running for president in the United States with $5 a gallon gasoline is problematic. And as an oil producer in the Middle East, you know, if you're in a market where oil is over $100 a barrel, there's a lot of political pressure back from your customers. And so these are countries, as I said, that may increase production in the short term, but they also recognize that longer term, the energy system needs change. And so they look towards innovative technologies to actually drive change in the energy system and to commercialize change quite quickly. We go over towards the east to China and partner countries. And we call this the Great Wall of Change. They're not immediately challenged by price or supply, largely because they're very dependent on large quantities of domestic coal. But nevertheless, they see turbulence ahead in the energy system. But they also recognize they have the existing capacity to change it. And that's the enormous manufacturing capacity that these countries bring to bear in terms of, for instance, lithium-ion batteries, solar cells, the construction of nuclear plants. All of these things are happening at very large scale in China and some of its partner countries. And therefore, they fall back on that to drive change and to cause and to bring about change in the energy system. And finally, we've looked at some very big economic blocks of countries, but there's a very important large number of countries that are both challenged on supply and on price. And we called these countries the surfers. These are countries that look towards the opportunities that emerge around the world from the other groups. And they ride the waves of those opportunities, And as a result, they may be very early adopters of technologies, they may be rapid uptakers of technology, but nevertheless, they are challenged because of the dual pressures of price and supply. Now, there are two types of surfers. We call the emergent surfers, big economies like Brazil and India, and the rising surfers, typically the lesser developed economies today. So this is our framework that we developed for thinking about the future, and it's a framework that is common to both of the scenarios that I'm going to talk about. And it underpins the scenario development. So just keep that in mind. These are these four groups, but with the surfers, there's an additional group as well. So that leads us to the scenario story itself. And two scenarios emerge from this: Archipelagos and Sky 2050. Archipelagos, and both of them reflect on the security mindset that is enveloping the world. Both of them recognize a shift in the way the transition is taking place and a shift towards a much more competitive transition. But in Archipelagos, it's security through self-interest prevails. It's a very fragmented and competitive response. And it's really a race to secure the energy system. In Sky 2050, it's mutual interest prevails. Still a very competitive landscape, still a competitive transition. But it brings about a healthy competition and an acceleration and a focus on changing the energy system. Now, Sky 2050 is in part normative by design. So it does reach net zero emissions in 2050, but that also collides with reality in the 2020s. So don't expect to see a world that can rapidly reduce emissions in the next 5 or 6 years. It has to look towards the 2030s and 2040s for the really steep emission reductions. So that is the scenario framework that we've developed. And let's just explore those two worlds for a moment. The Archipelagos world, as I said, is security through self-interest. And whilst I don't want to put this up as a list of sort of forecasts or predictions about the world, I want you to see it as symptomatic of this type of world. Don't be surprised if in the Archipelagos story, you would see the US retreating from the global stage. Or you might see, real turbulence in the global free trade consensus, the fading of international institutions and international treaties, and military proliferation. And I think we've seen examples of all this. Military proliferation just recently, Australia, the United States, and the UK agreeing to put more nuclear submarines into the Pacific theatre as part of the Australian naval fleet. Not something the Australians had ever considered before. So that's the Archipelagos world. And within that, the different archetypes, the Green Dream, the Great Wall of Change, they have different behaviours. Don't be surprised, for instance, that the surfers in this world have rapidly shifting alliances as they look for opportunities. This is a world where, on one day, India is buying discounted crude from Russia, and on the next day is happily seeking court in the United States or Europe around technology transfer and investment. Similarly, in the innovation wins countries, seeing the opportunity of disruption bringing opportunity for them. And in the Green Dream countries, the shock of the change really raising the fear of supply insecurity. Now, in the Sky 2050 world, as I said, mutual interest prevails, but it's still a very competitive transition, and that's how we're framing it. It's rooted in where we are today, so it has a very uneven start. As I said, this isn't a world where you see rapid reductions in the short term. But it's one where competition becomes healthy. It's where competition or developments in one part of the world drive rapid change in other parts of the world. And this is the sort of catalyst for moving the transition fast enough to reach net zero emissions by 2050. But policy support is critical in this scenario. Now, again, the different archetypes behave in different ways. The Great Wall of Change countries, there's a certain envy today about the level of market share they hold in green technologies. And so imagine in this world that drives a very healthy and positive competition globally to catch up. And I think we've seen a shift in just in recent months where, for instance, the US released the Inflation Reduction Act. The first reaction in Europe was was almost to object to it and wonder whether this was something that they could take to the World Trade Organization and challenge. But it seemingly is giving way to a healthy competition to outspend the Americans in this area. So that's the sort of world that we've imagined in the Sky 2050. So let's just dive into these stories a little bit more and get an idea of what they mean in terms of the energy system. And the first change really is that, for as long as almost all of us can remember, fossil fuels have had about an 80% share in the global primary energy mix. And that has been unchanging. And yet we are at a point in time, a point of inflection where that appears to be going to change. And it's just a question of how fast it changes. So the envelope for change is between 1 percentage point loss of market share per annum and 2 percentage points loss of market share per annum. That's the sort of pace of change that we see between these two scenarios. And this is driven by multiple energy transition tipping points around the world. And I'll get to one of the really key ones in a moment. Now, as we look from the primary energy system to the final energy system, there's an inflection point underway there as well. Almost since the day Edison put up his first grids in New York City and beyond, electricity has been growing in prominence in the primary energy mix, but at a fairly pedestrian rate of 2 percentage points per decade. So we're just over 20% of electricity in final energy now, after over 100 years of development of the electricity system. And we see an inflection point there. And the question is, how fast is this change going to manifest? It could possibly be as much as 10 percentage points per decade, so 1 percentage point per year, or perhaps 5%. But it's driven by electrification of the transport system, initially light passenger vehicles, then into the trucking system, and then into the residential system, where you're starting to see technologies like induction cooking and heat pumps replace natural gas, and then eventually into the industrial system, where even the cement industry today is looking at the possibility of electric kilns for limestone calcination. Not there yet by any stretch, but nevertheless, these are the sorts of developments that are underway around the world. Now, within all of this, it's solar PV that becomes the primary energy source, and it becomes a driver in itself for change. It's only a question of time before solar PV becomes the major component of the primary energy mix. And then it's only a question of even a bit more time before it overtakes the role of oil and gas and coal altogether. And depending on the scenario, that starts to manifest sort of between the 2040s and the 2060s. But solar PV we see as being an important driver of change. And the reason for that is simply the way that solar is manufactured and its availability globally. Now, today there's at least 200 gigawatts of solar module production capacity around the world. And every time we put this number up, there'll be people in the room say, no, it's 300 gigawatts or it's 400, but it's a lot and it's growing rapidly. I think that's the key point. And it's adding a lot of additional capacity into the primary energy mix every year. But the focus really needs to be not on how many modules are being produced, but how many factories to produce the modules are being produced. And there's a very healthy project pipeline of factory construction. And so that means that you get a compounding effect in this market, that you accelerate the number of factories, and each of those are putting out more modules every year, adding capacity to the grid, which is then delivering more electricity, and so on. You get, as I said, an effective compounding effect. To the extent that during this decade, and last week the BBC said it would be in 2023, but it doesn't matter, it's very close. You start to see a decline in the use for natural gas and coal for power generation. They just start to get backed out. So we're at that tipping point around about now somewhere, but it goes into rapid decline thereafter. And this becomes a driver for change because it pushes everything everywhere. Now, we've talked about electricity, and in Sky 2050, our more ambitious scenario, you get to about 50% electricity by the middle of the century. But of course, that still means that 50% are molecular fuels rather than 80% today. But that mix starts to change as well. It starts to shift away from, obviously, hydrocarbons and ethanol, and shifts more towards hydrogen, towards synthetic hydrocarbons, and towards advanced biofuels that you can use as a drop-in replacement for hydrocarbons. So synthetic hydrocarbons on the back of a biofeedstock. And the pace of change is really dependent on the scenario. One feature that does appear in Sky 2050 that we've said does not appear in Archipelagos is the emergence of synthetic fuels, because they rest on the back of a direct air capture industry that never really finds its place in the Archipelagos scenario. But nevertheless, a rapid development of these technologies. Again, you've got solar PV driving the production of hydrogen, driving the ability to bring down the cost of direct air capture and to introduce synthetic fuels. And all of these start to emerge and bring about change. Now, within these stories, they're not headwind free. And one of the headwinds that we've identified, and there are many others, particularly as you sort of look at Sky and imagine Archipelagos as well, is the supply of minerals. And of course, when you raise that, people immediately think of the rare earths, or they think of lithium, maybe they think of cobalt. But actually, it may be some of the more commonplace minerals that are problematic. And copper is an excellent example. So just looking at the electric car transition that's part of Sky 2050, and imagining that through to 2040, electric cars require more copper per vehicle and more copper in the infrastructure to fuel those vehicles than internal combustion engine vehicles. And if you multiply that out, what you see is that just to support the EV transition in the Sky 2050 scenario, irrespective of anything else going on in the world, you need more additional copper mining in the next 17 years than the extra copper mining from the last 17 years. And of course, there's a lot of other demands on copper as well, from other parts of the transition and from all the places that we use copper now anyway in the economy. So this is an area to watch, and certainly in Sky 2050, we've not put this up as a major barrier. We've recognized that it has the potential, but it could easily be one of the headwinds that slows down the transition leading to Archipelagos, let alone the trade friction that you might get in this security world around some of these minerals. Now, as the century starts to unfold, the carbon budget is exceeded. And that's true in both scenarios. The 380 billion tonnes that I talked about earlier is surpassed. And so 1.5 degrees C is surpassed. And so the ability to manage CO2 in the atmosphere and to capture CO2 before it enters the atmosphere becomes really important in both stories. But in Sky 2050, it has to take extraordinary prominence because of the need to limit warming to 1.5 by the end of the century. And in Sky 2050, there's up to 1 trillion tonnes of CO2 captured and stored. Now, some of that is through changes in land use, but a large portion is through carbon capture and storage and direct air capture associated with geological storage. And these emerge to become very large industries. In terms of, so as we start to bring all this together, we get these emission pathways. Sky 2050, emissions fall by about 12% during this decade by 2030. So the transition is well underway, but not the sort of 45% that was asked for in the Glasgow Climate Pact. And then the transition accelerates, and by 2050 we're at net zero emissions. But the amount of carbon capture and storage and land management change that has been built up in the interim and continues to be built allows the world to go into a period of negative emissions through to the end of the century. And as I said, something like 1 trillion tons of CO2 is captured and stored either in the land or geologically. Now, Archipelagos is a slower story. During the 2020s and into the 2030s, emissions even rise a little bit more, but not by a lot. And that's because of the rate of change of technologies like solar. But then they start to fall. And they start to fall quite quickly, but not fast enough to reach net zero emissions within this century. Now, if you put all this together, what is the temperature story that emerges from this? And so in Shell, we do all the energy modeling, but we work with the MIT Joint Program to, and use their climate models, or they use their climate models, to remodel our scenarios to give the temperature outcomes. And what you see is quite an interesting story. So first of all, as I said, both scenarios are passing 1.5 degrees C in the middle 2030s. But in Sky 2050, as it heads towards net zero emissions, that plateaus. It plateaus below 1.7 and then starts to decline because of the capacity that's in the system to manage CO2. And it reduces by so much that by the end of the century, you're back to where we are today, with the tantalizing prospect that in the 22nd century, you could actually embark on a climate restoration project. Now, in Archipelagos, of course, that sink capacity just isn't there. It's there, it's not absent, but it's not there to the same extent. And it's not till the early 22nd century that you're reaching net zero emissions. But the temperature plateaus at around 2.2 degrees C. So a bit higher than the higher goal of the Paris Agreement. But the days of imagining outcomes of 3 degrees and 4 degrees C of warming, we think are over. And that's simply because of the dynamics that exist in the energy system today. So we end up in 2100 with a temperature envelope between 1.2 and 2.2 degrees C. Quite a different, a narrow and much lower outcome than we've seen in any of our scenarios or we see in any other collection of scenarios. Nevertheless, there's still a gap between these two stories, and it's considerable. It's about 1.5 trillion tons of CO2 cumulatively by the end of the century. And it doesn't just appear in one sector, it's right across the economy. But one of the biggest differences between the two stories is the role of sinks, the role of land management change, and the role of carbon capture and storage, and the emergence of a direct air capture industry. And so we come to the sort of the policy framework to deliver the change, to bring us from the Archipelagos type world towards the Sky 2050 world. And that starts with the shape of the nationally determined contributions that we will be seeing after the stocktake, and so that would be at COP30. But it has to be followed by a domestic policy framework that cascades through the 2020s, 2030s, and 2040s. That encourages innovation, that consolidates those changes and steers us towards these types of technologies through, for instance, carbon pricing, and then ensures that there's no backtracking in the system. And all the while, you need a framework that activates and grows the carbon capture and storage industry and the need for land use change. Now, an important group of countries within this story, which I talked a little bit about at the beginning, are those that we call the rising surfers, the less developed economies today. And if you just look at their very low carbon footprint now, but consider the population that exists and the population growth that is likely, that group alone, just maintaining the current carbon footprint, would still take us beyond 2 degrees C. And if they moved up to anywhere close to the carbon footprint that we have on a per capita basis, then you're at sort of 3 degrees or even more. And so it's critical that these economies develop and grow their energy service needs on the back of the newer energy technologies. And we think that's entirely plausible. In fact, in the slower scenario, which is shown on the right-hand side of the screen, Archipelagos, the rising surfers hardly see any change in their carbon footprint per capita, and in fact it drifts down as the century progresses. In Sky 2050, it's even faster. And this is simply because of the opportunity presented by the wave of new technologies coming through, and in particular solar PV. Now, I thought it would be just important to sort of get some visualization of what the transition might look like from an emissions point of view. And this is the story as we might see it today. Globally, obviously, most of the CO2 comes from fossil fuel extraction, and almost all of that ends up as CO2 in the atmosphere. But there's CO2 coming from anthropogenic land use change, and also from industries such as cement. The bioenergy industry is effectively a closed loop, because as you grow biomass to turn into energy, you take the CO2 out of the atmosphere and you return it when that energy is used. By the time you get to 2050, this is what the energy system looks like in Sky 2050. It's one where fossil fuels have reduced by nearly 2/3, so they're not gone, but there's an enormous dependence on carbon capture and storage to manage CO2 in the economy. The bioenergy industry has grown, partly for energy needs, but also because it's linked with carbon capture and storage as a removal mechanism. But a whole new industry has emerged in the form of direct air capture and the beginnings of a synthetic fuel industry. And of course, the land use change story has reversed through an end to deforestation, reforestation, but protection of other land areas like wetlands, mangroves, grasslands, and a big focus globally on agricultural practices and carbon farming, effectively focusing on the carbon content of the land as part of the remit of a farmer. By the time you get to 2100, the fossil fuel economy is effectively gone. Fossil fuels are used for making things, so petrochemicals. There's a few legacy industries all using CCS. But the fossil fuel era is largely over. And it's direct air capture that's emerged as the largest sort of gas handling industry globally, of course, along with the hydrogen economy. Now, I thought then it would be useful, we're at a decarbonisation summit focusing on Europe. What does this look like in the European context? And so the same set of pictures. This is Europe today, very similar, but obviously the numbers very different. There's about 3.1 billion tonnes of emissions in the European context, but land use change is positive. There's net emissions from the cement industry, and there's a bioenergy industry. By 2050 in the EU, this is what the story looks like. The system is net negative. The system is effectively at net zero emissions. But the fossil economy still hasn't shrunk quite enough. There hasn't been that huge build-out sorry, my mistake. This is the Archipelagos story first of all. So in the Archipelagos story, you see the transition taking shape, progressing quickly, but we're still in a net emitting economy in 2050 in Europe. So the goals of the EU aren't quite met in terms of the energy transition. And emissions have reduced from over 3 billion tonnes to about 1.2 billion tonnes, but still continuing to fall. Direct air capture as an industry hasn't emerged at all in the European context. By the time you get to 2050 in the Sky context, it's a different story. Direct air capture has emerged. There's a much more prevalence of CCS in the story, the faster transition overall, a shift in land use management, and you're at net zero emissions or near net zero emissions in the energy system and net negative emissions overall. So the EU meets its goals in this 2050 story, But it's still quite a stretch to do it, and it's not the fossil fuel system that has quite reached net zero emissions by that point in time. So I'm going to stop there. This is a story of two different scenarios, two very different worlds in terms of the energy transition. They're both driven by intense competition. They're both driven by the need for security. We end up with a temperature range somewhere between 1.2 and 2.2 degrees C. And a turning point during this decade in the role of fossil fuels in the energy system. So, thank you very much, and hopefully you've got a few minutes for some questions.
Yes. David, thank you. Please join me. And we have time for some questions. Yep. I'm going to take my privilege and ask the first question.
Yep.
Of course, 1.5 and 2 are average temperatures. When you're working with MIT, what is the sort of range of temperatures? What are the extremes we can expect?
Well, I think I don't know specifically I don't think we've. I'd have to go into the MIT paper. So MIT have done this work. They've written up a paper on the analysis, and that's available on the MIT Joint Program website. But I think, like all of these, you would see enhanced warming at the poles. That is a feature of almost all of these models. The exact number, I off the top of my head, I don't know. Sorry about that.
And that leads to a second question about you've shown the energy security, but I'm aware that along with that you are looking at social aspects.
Yeah. So in what regard?
In regard of the impact global warming has on different societies around the world.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think up to about 2.2 degrees C, or at least the temperature range that's here, 1.2 to 2.2, fits well within the bottom two of the recent IPCC scenarios. So you're at quite a lower range. It fits well within therefore the lower range analysis that they've done on impacts. So, for instance, in the sea level change by 2100 in both stories is not dissimilar, because the dynamics of sea level is quite slow to appear, unless there's a sort of an extraordinary change in ice shelf activity. But so it's in both. It's just either side of 0.5 meters, so not inconsiderable, right? So, nevertheless, for the centuries and even millennia after that, Archipelagos is leaving a legacy of a much higher sea level rise. So you're looking at something like a few meters versus 10 plus meters. So this is a troubling story. I think the other thing that we looked at in a bit more detail during this century, at least, is the ability to manage the food supply at these levels of warming. And at least, diving into the IPCC work that has just been released in the impacts report, which was last year, even at 2.2 degrees C, with adaptation, there's not a lot of shift in crop yields. But you're on the borderline of, of where that starts to become very problematic. And it's problematic if there's not a serious effort to adapt as well. So these are not scenarios without problems. But equally, there are scenarios, at least in the context of this century, where adaptation is possible. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, we've got lots of interest. So where do we start? Let's start down the front for a change. Please, again.
Good morning. My name is Patrick Coles from Yokogawa. Thank you for the presentation. The question I have is, you present, the way I understand the IPCC scenarios is 1.5 degrees is not just a temperature, it's a tipping point. And at that point, effects start taking place that might be irreversible. And in the scenarios, we sort of think, we happily overshoot, and at some point we'll regulate the whole thing back down again. Isn't that being over-optimistic?
No, so I looked into this in some depth in the IPCC, and So they don't say that there's tipping points. What they say is that there's increased risk of change. I think they're very clear on that. This is a risk profile story. So I'm not arguing that this is a risk-free world at all. That's not the point here. But they also I think if you look at it, that there was some indication, at least as my reading of the IPCC report, that a limited period of overshoot, whilst not ideal, is not impossible to manage either. That it doesn't necessarily force major change in the system. Well, it's not our gamble. I'm not arguing that this is okay. We're looking, our job is to, as a scenario team, is to look at where the energy system is today and look at what is possible under different social, geopolitical, and technology stories. Sky 2050 represents what we see as a group of energy professionals as the fastest plausible change that could be implemented, I guess without the caveat of massive civil disruption in the way in which we live our lives. So we haven't engaged in that. But then I don't see any government that is even close to engaging in that activity where they're just shutting things down and preventing us from doing things. And do you see that as a political reality in the next 15 years? I'm sorry, I don't. But so yes, we do see an overshoot. It goes up to about between 1.6 and 1.7. And the industrial capacity is there to correct that. And the land use management changes are there to help correct that. Whether or not we do that as a society remains to be seen. Reading in the IPCC report, yeah, of course, you are going into that very high risk area. There's no doubt about that. But risk is different from actuality. So yeah, we are, but we already know that we're toying with a high risk strategy, just where we are today, irrespective of what the future brings.
Hi, Daniel Mullen from SSE Thermal. Thanks very much for talk. Very, very interesting. Both scenarios paint actually quite a positive outlook on the future of the world. It's not ideal, but it's in the lower end of what scenarios are out there.
Yep.
What would you see as the main risk to not achieving, say, the archipelago
Archipelago story. So I think we looked at it from the other perspective. What are the risks that shift us away towards archipelagos? Because we honestly see archipelagos as a very plausible scenario built on trends that are quite apparent today, such as the solar PV story that I talked about. And there's already quite a lot of headwinds within this system. We haven't designed this as a happy world. It's quite a problematic world, but it's driven by a lot of these problems actually drive change in themselves. I think we've collectively imagined that the world gets to, manages emissions through cooperation. And in fact, what we've tried to look at is the world not managing emissions through cooperation, but to manage emissions through competition. And it's that competition forced by the energy security problems that have emerged today that really exaggerates that, really accelerates that change. I think perhaps, perhaps one of the looming issues sits in the geopolitical area where there is an enormous dependence today, and continues to be, on the manufacturing capabilities in a few countries, and on the resources. You're moving from a resource dependence on the Middle East to a resource dependence on other countries. And just in the last few months, we saw civil disruption in Peru. Partly as a result of food prices. It sort of was a straw that broke the camel's back that was already labouring under concerns about the politics there, and it upset the copper supply chain. So, but I think all of these push you more toward, they push you more towards archipelagos. Do they overshoot it? I mean, possibly, yes. But I think we've tried to be realistic in looking at the trends that exist today and seeing where they take us. And they seem to take us towards an accelerated story.
Okay, so the assessment is that given the current market drivers that are out there and geopolitical standing, that it's almost inevitable that this will occur, is essentially what I'm...
I think what we said on one of the slides was that it's almost, that so net zero emissions is inevitable, not necessarily in this century, but it's inevitable. And we're sort of a bit more circumspect. I think there's a slide there that says temperature outcomes above 2.5 appear highly unlikely. So there's a little bit more wiggle room there, perhaps. But I think we certainly stand by the two stories that are there as not bookends, but as two possible outcomes. Yes.
Okay, thanks. It's a very interesting sort of viewpoint.
Thank you. Yeah, so Luke Tan from Supercritical.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Oh, sorry, it's two.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think it's yours. Go on.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, Luke Tan, Supercritical. When I look at the sort of the Sky scenario, that all sounds really good. It sounds to be quite dependent on solar and direct air capture. What do you perceive to be sort of the biggest risks in achieving the scale that we need in both solar and direct air capture?
So I think in solar we appear to be well on the way. The acceleration is a very positive development, and the pipeline of factories to build more solar modules looks very strong. I think in direct air capture we've made, it's fair to say we've made an ambitious assumption that the costs really can come down. That there's enough technology innovation within that sphere that brings the cost down. I mean, today the cost of direct air capture, depending on who you ask, is anywhere between $300 to $700 per ton of CO2. And there's a lot of ambition for the first big project in the US that it will bring costs down, I think, to around 200. But it doesn't actually exist yet, and they haven't actually delivered those sort of cost reductions. That being said, we haven't assumed that direct air capture just appears spontaneously today. In the scenario, it doesn't really appear until the very first sort of pencil-thin line of direct air capture starts to appear in 2040, right? So it's not like it has to mature and suddenly be an available technology in the next 3 years. It's got another 17 years to allow that cascade of change to take place. I would agree with you that if you were assuming that you needed it tomorrow and that you had to start building hundreds of units, I just don't think that's plausible now. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. This is Concetto Fischetti. I work for ENI, and I'm seconded to IOGP, the International Oil and Gas Producer Association. David, thank you for the clarity of the message and the effectiveness of the delivery. Actually, I'd like to expand on the CCUS role and the rate on both scenarios, the Archipelagos and the Sky 50. How do you feel CCUS in terms of gigaton will be waiting in both scenarios?
So CCS, in the Sky 2050 scenario, we're up into the multiple gigaton range, 4 and 5 billion tons of capture and storage every year. And that makes it an industry that is actually as big as the natural gas industry today in terms of gas volumes. So it's obviously you get more gas weight because CO2 has a higher molecular weight than natural gas or than methane. But in terms of volume, it's equivalent. I think it's about equivalent to the natural gas industry today. So very, very sizable. This is not a small industry. So it's, and in fact, you're relying on developing a capture and compression and transport industry that's in 30 years that's bigger than the LNG industry that we've got today that's taken 60 years. So this is quite an accelerated change. Yeah. In Archipelagos, it's CCS emerges. It's on a much lower scale. By the end of the century, I think it's about a gigaton of storage per annum. So it's still big, but Sky 2050, there's no escaping it. And you have to be able to limit warming to 1.5, you have to bring in large-scale sink capacity, given where we are with the carbon budget and the rate of change that you have in all of the other technologies.
So basically, in the worst scenario, you envisage about 1 gigaton of CO2 storage.
Yeah, I think it's about a gigaton. Yeah, plus, both scenarios assume that the growing pressures in the land system force change. They're just on different timelines. So in Sky 2050, it's quite an accelerated timeline where, for instance, the Glasgow Declaration on Deforestation is actually achieved. That's largely ending at this decade. You have to do that to get to this. In Archipelagos, the story lags by at least 20 years, but it's not absent. So in that story, land use change and land management, land carbon management, just continually rises up the global agenda until it gets managed. And I don't think, we shouldn't imagine scenarios where things just never happen, because if a system gets worse and worse and worse, no matter how much political procrastination there is, eventually it gets addressed. And I think we've seen that, time and time again. We all worry about the procrastination, but eventually something happens. And so Archipelagos is more in that vein, that this isn't a world where these things don't happen. They do, because there's a growing pressure from climate, biodiversity, and other aspects that eventually forces the hand of the world and the politicians and everybody else to actually address them. But it's a 2.2 world, not 1.5.
I see two hands up. Have we got time for two more? I think we have. So let's start.
Your agenda, I'm fine.
Yes. Samantha first. Yeah.
So Samantha Nicholson from Floor. This is an easy question. So it was just with your solar PV, understanding that you feel solar PV will be the leader. What do you consider being the energy storage solution to go with that?
Yeah, to be honest, actually, coming back to Luke's question, that's probably one of the other ambitious assumptions that that we've assumed, certainly in Sky 2050, there's been a bit of a leap in terms of energy management. So it's a combination of things. It's not just batteries, it's a combination of grid expansion. So you need a lot of grid development, which puts pressure on things like on minerals, copper and aluminium and all the things associated with longer storage grid. It challenges the energy security story. So for instance, you could imagine in this story a country like Singapore being heavily dependent on its neighbours for electricity, which brings about an energy security concern. So Sky 2050, assumes that progresses, and so storage, as I said, is managed through lots of changes. There's no single solution, but grids are one of the big pieces of that. Singapore or South Asia, building an undersea grid with potentially Singapore getting energy from Northern Australia and places like that. So quite ambitious, yes. In Archipelagos, that's a much slower story. So there's plenty of time for all of that to develop.
Joachim, please.
Yes, very interesting. The world's largest emitter of CO2 is China, accounting for almost the same amount of CO2 emissions today as Europe and the US combined.
Yep.
In September 2020, they started the launch of the 2030-2060 program. So what is happening in China will have an enormous impact on the aggregated numbers in your scenario. So how are you taking this into consideration, this 2030-2060 program in China?
So in the Sky 2050 scenario, there's a very bold requirement on China. And I'll say a requirement, it's not an assumption, you just have to see it happen. And that is that by the mid-2030s, they have to have reduced emissions by about 40% from their peak in the mid-2020s. So 10 years to really make an astounding change. But if you look at the manufacturing capacity that is emerging there and is already in place there, it's a stretch, but nevertheless possible to think about that happening. So I think that's the underlying story really for China, is that manufacturing capacity actually brings about change. In Archipelagos, and I guess in Sky 2050 you'll get some early retirements of some of the coal capacity, simply also on economic grounds, simply because the solar PV allows you to do that. In Archipelagos, it's about a 20-year longer story. So, the Chinese emissions don't start to fall till well into the 2040s, or they start to fall, but not markedly till then. And there's no early retirements of capacity. It just drifts off the grid as time takes its toll.
Good. Thank you very much. I'm sure there's more questions, but unfortunately we've run out of time.
Yep, no, that's fine.
David, I would like to say on behalf of everybody here, thank you very much for a very informative discussion that I think will help us not just today, but as we leave today and the discussion today. I think it gives us all food for thought as we go about our work in decarbonisation.
Good. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, everybody.